Do any early non biblical sources tell us anything about Jesus? The answer might surprise you. Let's take a quick look at what 8 different non Christian sources tell us about Jesus. In a letter to the Roman Emperor Trajan, Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governor, asked the emperor advice on how to deal with Christians. The main reason he was asking for advice was because they would not worship the emperor's image. He wrote that Christians would meet together regularly to sing to Christ as if to a god. The first century Jewish historian Josephus wrote the following. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher, of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. Josephus also wrote about the high priest Ananus. He assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. Tacitus, the famous Roman historian, said that the name Christian comes from Christ, a person who was executed by Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus also confirmed that the number of followers Jesus had increased significantly after his death and spread from Jerusalem all the way to Rome. Thallus, the first century historian, amazingly wrote about the darkness and the earthquake that took place during the time of the crucifixion. Thallus claimed that a solar eclipse during the resurrection accounted for the darkness that occurred. Phlegon, another first century historian, also mentioned the darkness and earthquake. This amazing verification, independent of the gospel writers Matthew, Mark, and Luke, admits that those authors are correct, at least on that point. Phlegon also said Jesus seemed to predict the future and that Christians believe Jesus rose after death and showed signs of crucifixion. Roman historian Suetonius said Jesus was a real man called Christ, and he caused a Jewish disturbance. Celsus, the Roman philosopher, said Jesus was allegedly born of a virgin. His earthly father was a carpenter, and he had miraculous power. The Jewish Talmud mentions that Jesus was executed the day before the Passover and that he had magical power. We can conclude, based on these non-Christian sources, that Jesus lived. He was Jewish. Jesus lived in the first third of the first century. People believed he was born out of wedlock. Jesus was a wise teacher. He did wondrous feats. He gathered disciples. Jesus conflicted with the Jewish authorities. He led Jews away from their beliefs. Jesus is described as having magical power. Some believed he was the Messiah. Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. There was darkness and an earthquake at the time of his death. Jesus was believed to be seen raised from the dead by his followers, who now worship him as if he were God. The number of his followers increased dramatically after his death, and his brother James was martyred by the high priest Ananus. That's a pretty good list, and that's before we examine any testimony from the Bible itself. To say that the authors of the New Testament are unreliable because they are Christians would be a prime example of the genetic fallacy, an informal logical fallacy. The authors weren't Christians until after they had seen and heard the resurrected Jesus and the evidence of his resurrection for themselves. The New Testament documents are strengthened by non-biblical sources, not undermined.